So thanks everybody for joining. My name is Jessica Malati Rivera. I am a senior advisor at the Pandemic Prevention Institute by way of the Pandemic Tracking Collective, which is a lot of words. Basically, a lot of you know me here from the COVID Tracking Project. A group of us joined this initiative as the Pandemic Tracking Collective to help support PPI's work on tracking data in this next chapter of the pandemic. And I'm joined here by Brianna Thrift, who is a data analyst at the Pandemic Prevention Institute, and Manisha Bingi, who is the Managing Director of Partnerships at PPI and Rockefeller Foundation. So thank you both for being here and for spending your time this afternoon with me. I'm really excited to talk about some of the topics that we have. If you guys wanted to say hello first to the followers, by all means, go for it.
Yes,
yeah, it's a pleasure being here.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Jessica, for moderating.
Awesome.
Yes.
First, I know we're still kind of ahead of schedule, but that's fine. I think we've got a good number of people who are on here. We'll keep the conversation about 30 minutes. And again, as I mentioned before, we're going to save this. It'll be available on our grids. My personal grid, and also PPI and RF. If you're not following those accounts, please do. There's going to be a ton of really great content coming out in the next several months on all of the accounts. So let's just jump in. Brianna, I want to start with you, and I'd love to hear about what drew you to a career in STEM. What did you study, and what have you been doing in your career?
Yes. Thinking back to what drew me, I definitely have to credit my dad. He majored in chemistry in college, so he's always been very much encouraging my sister and I to go into STEM. So when I went to college, I started as a biochem major, but I actually really struggled with STEM, specifically mathematics in college. I always tell folks the first statistics class I took, I did not pass. But yeah, I'm a data scientist today. So looking back just at courses and the struggle there, what really sustained me in STEM was in graduate school. I had an amazing statistics professor. His name was Dr. Hector Lemus, and he was so invested in his students and made sure to, offer office hours and give real life examples to his students that really resonated with students who came from marginalized communities. So I think having a professor that was, Latino and that gave examples that really resonated with underserved communities made me want to pursue doing data science and statistics in my career. So I studied epidemiology and biostatistics in college, and then started working in data science roles, specifically doing public health work. So I've done a ton of HIV and tuberculosis research as a data scientist. Did a few jobs doing safety in transportation research, and am now working on the COVID-19 pandemic. So yeah, that's kind of just an overall summary.
Awesome. Manisha, what about
you? It's a
you?
long, complicated journey. How much time do we have? But seriously, yeah, I come from a family, just like Brianna, I come from a family that is, mathematics and science driven, family of engineers and doctors. And I think if you talk to any Indian family, you do have your fair share of engineers and doctors, and that's where you get channeled. Yeah, I moved from India to the US sort of in the late 90s and for college here, and really fell into the topics that you have competency into. So it was economics, mathematics, and computer science. So that's where I did my bachelor's. I did try to be a little contrarian to the push, and did psychology, and that was the only C I got in my freshman year. So I can imagine my parents were like, "Look, you're good at math. Stick with math." Like, okay, so that's where I started. But I always loved, my passion is around people, and thinking about how people behave, and the social sciences drew me. which is why I leaned into economics, which is the most quantitative of social sciences out there, and focused on global health economics, and found a niche that really straddles the application of technology for challenges, development challenges writ large. And I'm a technology optimist and a realist. And I really feel that technology is an enabler. And for those of us who are, in the fields or come from the fields of the sciences, it is an additional privilege to really translate those perspectives and that cutting edge effort into leapfrogging communities and countries into the 21st century.
Awesome. Amazing. I love both of those stories. I also come from a family of lots of STEM inclined folks and was from an immigrant family as well, and very much had the options of being a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. Had the proclivity to, pursue things in science and math, and did well in that. But I deviated from the norm a bit. And when I decided not to go to medical school, to my parents' dismay, I decided to go more into public health. It was a big conversation, but one that I think was probably the best from the norm that I could have taken, because it's brought me to where I am right now, which is a combination of a lot of like hard science, high science stuff, but still on the public health side, which I have really, really loved. Going into kind of what it's like to be a woman of color in this space and thinking about this from an industry perspective, as an industry for non-white women, what's going well in public health specifically, and what's not going well? Brianna, I'd love for you to start.
Yes. I'll start with what's not going well, just so we can end on a positive note. In general, I think there's still a lot of systematic oppression and discrimination that women of color face in the industry. I'll speak specifically to Black women because there's so many nuances when we talk about women of color. But it's difficult in the education space and in the workspace. And I think once you get your foot in the door and you're hired, that's kind of half the battle. Then you have to deal with discrimination and, negotiating to make sure you're paid your worth, trying to make sure that you're heard, but at the same time, not seen as being aggressive or too assertive. So I think there's just a lot of stereotypes that you're challenged with. And there's a very closed box of respectability and what it means to be a respectable professional in the industry. And that box is very much created by white men. So as a Black woman, it's difficult to try to fit within that culture, but then try to make space for myself where I'm comfortable. So there's just so many different barriers from the education and the workspace. Something new, I think, that happened more so in 2021 when the Black Lives Matter movement really started to pop off was a bunch of companies wanted to hire Black women and hire Black professionals, but it was very much in a performative sense where they did not want to invest in these professionals and really help develop them, which led to people getting hired, but then they were kind of stuck in this space of not being comfortable, meeting a diversity quota, but not really feeling included. So yeah, I mean, that leads to a bunch of professional consequences, like not developing and therefore not getting promoted or staying at the same pay. So those are just kind of some of the barriers that I'm still noticing, and some new barriers that I'm noticing with this new wave of everyone wanting to be diverse, but not really. As far as the good things that are going well, there is more diversity in the workplace, and there's more women of color who are opted into leadership positions, like yourself and Manisha. It's great having that as a model and seeing y'all as mentors as women of color in leadership positions. That is something I did not see in college or really grow up seeing. So seeing that now as, an adult, really getting into my career, that's been really encouraging and influential. I would also say there's a lot more programs that are meant to serve women of color to get into the tech and public health space. A lot of mentorship platforms and free programs that folks can enroll in. and it kind of funnels folks into
Mhm.
those positions. So I'll stop there, but yeah.
Manisha, what about your experience? What do you feel like is working? What's not going
Yeah,
well?
I'll pick up where Brianna left off and really acknowledge how far we have actually come. I mean, and I think about public health, I'll think about global public health. So this is sort of beyond, the US context. You see about 20, maybe even 30 years ago, you look at, who's around the table. And there was very little diversity, both from a geographic, regional, gender, perspective standpoint, and we have come a long way since then in the last 20 years. So I think we want to acknowledge that there are a lot more women in leadership positions. You see the chair of CEPI, which is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation. I'm going to mess that up. Who is an Indian woman, and again, that there are role models out there. I do want to pick on Brianna's point around.
Yeah.
We have a long way to go, and we need to balance sort of still being a minority and the biases that you face, as part of that minority. And a couple of examples are, you're in a room, it's still about, one of maybe two, if not the only woman in the room. Somebody wants coffee, everyone turns and looks at you. Because that's sort of an inherent bias. And I was like, no, I'm not the one picking up getting coffee, that they get your own coffee. And, you still need to fight those, they're very implicit biases around what it means to be a woman outside of what it means to be a professional. There's a need to be more helpful. There's a need to be more nurturing, more nuanced, more calm. You can't be aggressive. And I think we have ways to go in defining ourselves, and I think the only people who can do that is us. And we as a group need to, have solidarity into who we are as we present ourselves as women, and women of color are part of that group in an evolving profession, and be part of that journey, because we've come a long way and we can go further.
Yeah, I feel so many of those sentiments myself, having been, in this space for a good bit, and thinking about some of the overt biases and the implicit biases. And I bring this one up a lot just because I feel like it is significant. It is something that I've made a conscious effort of, especially being in a more public facing role. But I mean, I had an employer years ago that would tell me to go to the blow dry bar and straighten my hair before we had client meetings because my hair was too curly. And that sticks with me. Every time I'm in front of the camera, every time I do an Instagram live, every time I have to produce some presentation to stakeholders, because, there is this assumption that either as a woman of color or a woman with textured hair or just a woman in general, whatever the bias is, that it's somehow less than or not as professional as what we have seen as normative in this space that is dominated largely by males, largely by white males. And I think that I too am encouraged to see those trends. I too think we have a long way to go. I think COVID-19 in particular, though, has, because of how the pandemic has affected so many communities of color, has forced those of us who are in these spaces as experts, as leaders, to kind of step up and use our own voice and speak on behalf of our communities, because we're kind of tired of being spoken about and having other people represent us in, whether it's, communications or other work, being kind of taken over by people who aren't as affected by it. So let's bring it to some more personal experiences. I kind of helped segue with that a little bit, but if you could tell me about, personal things that have happened to you in your career in STEM, how do you think your identity has affected your experiences? If it's informed your work, and if there have been any specific barriers with your identity in your work? Brianna.
Yeah, that's a good question. As you mentioned, public health, we very much learn about the discrepancies and disparities that largely affect marginalized communities. So I think just having that knowledge and seeing it firsthand within the Black community has really encouraged me to go into public health and affected my perspective. I know that as a data analyst, there's a lot of biases that go into the research that we do, stemming from the data that we collect to the data that we analyze, the methods and how we analyze, and the strategic solutions that we develop to try to answer how to mitigate whatever problem we're trying to solve. So I think my perspective as a Black woman, I'm really able to contribute a perspective that is different, a bias that is different from what is normally at the table. I mean, of course, everyone has biases, but I think if you pick and pull different types of biases, you can get a more cohesive story and solutions that are well-rounded instead of solutions that are only aimed to prioritize a certain community. You're able to, bring concerns to the table from marginalized communities and make sure that those concerns are considered and accounted for when you're really trying to brainstorm towards solutions.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Manisha?
I mean, that's an interesting question, right? I mean, in my sort of role, I work with sort of global partners from multiple countries. And I think, that itself brings a form of representation to the table in terms of diversity, not just, there's cultural, there is regional perspectives that you bring. And I grew up in India. So I come from both a culture as well as a family background where we fought for our independence from colonial powers. So to some extent, sort of, that perspective is ingrained in me to ensure that there is a voice that our partners have at the table, that they are truly represented, and they are driving towards self-sufficiency to the best way that we are able to empower them to be. And I think that is a very personal sort of focus for me, which sort of drives me to, where I work, why I am here, and what I do, and how I do it. So it's very much, if we think about from an identity standpoint, it's not so much as a woman, but more as an Indian from a country, which is still developing, has a lot of poverty, that I grew up surrounded by, have been given the privilege, both from a family standpoint to do what I can do and be encouraged to do it, and from a professional standpoint to be in a path and in a role that allows me to do it. I think, as from a gender standpoint, it's the same sort of implicit issues that we all are dealing with on a regular basis. But sometimes when we are outside with different cultures, and not all of them are, the various sort of levels of progressive elements or lack thereof within those. So it's a learned behavior in terms of what do you take personally, what do you fight, and how do you protect yourself when that is something that's needed to do, and still stand your ground and move the agenda forward. So all of it sort of comes together.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you are able to bring in that resistance and that desire for representation and freedom in a professional setting. Because I think a lot of times the sentiments of how people even talk about anti-colonial powers seems too risky to bring into an office space, or too controversial to bring into a table in which you want to make sure that all the voices are heard. And I think that there's a time and place for that. And it's cool to know, especially in your role, that you're able to do that for others. Which brings me to my next question. Have you been able to connect with other women of color in STEM, either in previous roles, in this role? What has that been like? Can you give examples of what that kind of, allyship has been like for you? Brianna, I'll start with you.
I wish I could connect more with women of color in STEM. There's few of us, so I think the community is tightly knitted. Like, I've been able to connect with women of color within my own company, such as yourself and Manisha. There's also global other networks that you can find through professional organizations and LinkedIn. So women of color in STEM, I definitely, want to push women to look for those networks, because I think it's great when trying to identify mentorship and asking for advice, whether that's advice on negotiation or how to climb the ladder, or how to deal with patriarchy in the workplace, because that's very real. And a lot of women would offer some great advice for that. So that's been my experience with Connected with Women of Color. Definitely wish there were more spaces and platforms for that. Yes.
Yeah. How about you, Manisha?
I think I've been very lucky. I think, we encountered a wide range of really impressive and high achieving women in the field. And again, it comes from the fact that we are again privileged to work in a place like the foundation that gives us access to that breadth of engagement. The one thing I will say is, if you think about STEM and there's a scientific effort, and I think women in science, especially the biological sciences and life sciences, have a lot more. There's a lot more representation there, and a lot more in terms of as a community. Very collaborative and nurturing. I think if you think about, technology, and particularly in the digital and startup world, I think that's a little different in the scale of representation, and it's a harder sell. It's a very well documented space where it takes a lot more, and it's a lot harder for women to be credible, to lean in, and really, be successful. So I want to sort of put that nuance when we think about STEM and we think about science and technology. There is different elements across that dimension that have different experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about, Manisha, your specific role as the managing director of partnerships and how global it is. Can you tell us about kind of what you've seen in that work when it comes to representation, what you've seen especially on like women who are in the same room as you? How has your identity changed your approach in this role?
I mean, as you rightly said, it's a truly global, footprint, which allows access. I think I will say that, it is still dominated by men, and I think that is very much a reality of the world we live in. Especially as we look at developing countries, I think gender roles are still very ingrained. So when you see women who have reached high achieving positions within those institutions, it is very often at cost and at a personal cost, and that's a reality that we have. The interesting thing is there, from the policy side of the spectrum, there is a lot more engagement than in the hard sciences, and I think that's what we have seen. And when you come in as both from an identity as well as a representation standpoint, as well as being part of the foundation, the fact that you have an entity and an organization that you represent and it's behind you helps and adds credibility and presence to the room. So I think that's something that's a lesson is, it's who we are and also what we represent from an institutional standpoint and a power dynamic standpoint that can tip the balance in terms of how you're received and, how people engage with you. So. And that's actually been a reality. I think if I'd been present in the room as not a member of the Rockefeller Foundation team, as not a donor at the table, I think the response and the engagement will be very different than what it is, because suddenly you have power. And you have power at the negotiating table, and suddenly you're met as an equal and a credible stakeholder to engage with. So it's what you bring. It's not just who you are. It's what you bring to the table beyond that.
And the hope is that when you enter a room, it wouldn't have to be just the name and the entity that you represent that gives you that power, but just your presence and your individual, capabilities and skill set. But,
I think that's a really important point. I think, it's not what people start with. And I'll be very honest, you come in, you're an Indian woman, you're young looking, you don't look your age, you walk in. Most people elsewhere, as they think about their sort of daughter, their niece, their, wife, what have you, their girlfriend, and those biases get a hold of them. Once they start dealing with you as a professional, And because
Okay.
they have to deal with you as a professional, those biases start changing. And by the time you're meeting them for the second or third time, you are a different person and you're a professional, not someone who's defined by her gender identity or sort of a race. And I think that transition is a work in progress, but it's getting there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Brianna, as a data analyst and as a Black woman, I'm curious about how your proximity to this data has made you feel, how you've showed up for this work. I know COVID-19 has been very deeply traumatizing to the Black community, and I'm just curious about what that experience has been like for you, so close to the numbers, which are not just numbers, right? They're people.
Yes, and that point you just made, I think it makes it difficult to be a Black professional working on COVID-19 response. 'Cause I think sometimes you work with colleagues and they very much look at the data as these are just, you know, ones and zeros on a spreadsheet. But for so many Black individuals, just knowing the COVID-19 disparity has had a enormous impact on the Black community. These are not just ones and zeros. This is my brother, this is my cousin, this is my uncle. So it's difficult because I am working with, like, you know, mortality data. So it can become sensitive in that way. And I think it's important to be just aware of who you're talking to when you're talking about COVID-19 research and data, and just be aware that, you know, public health data in general, this is not to make profit. This is not talking about, you know, money. These numbers are people's lives and people's livelihood. So yes, I think that's a huge point. And then further than working within public health, as a Black woman, I just find that I bring a lot of passion to the table, and sometimes it's not appreciated, but there's just such a deep history of, you know, state sanctioned violence against Black people. And I'll say the African diaspora in general, whether we're talking about, you know, health consequences from colonialism or redlining or just the history of Henrietta Lacks. There's just so much disasters of public health that very intentionally targeted the Black community. So there's a lot of passion that comes to the table when I'm doing the research, because I want to make sure that our data leads to action, and not action. I mean, no action can reverse what has been done, but there definitely needs to be accountability and a way of mitigating what has been done. So that's kind of my perspective. I'm very much a data to action analyst.
Yeah. Well, I love your passion, and I don't want you to tone that down even the least, because I think it is so necessary. And as we wrap things up, I want to finish with one question, which I'll answer first, and then we'll wrap it all up. But as we wrap up Women's History Month this year, I'd love to know what you're looking forward to being different by next March. Like, what would be something that you'd be super excited about changing for women in STEM, women of color in STEM, public health practitioners who are in this space? One thing that I feel like I have talked a lot about throughout this pandemic is the value of trust. And I think that all of us in our roles in responding to COVID-19 and this pandemic, and trying to be part of pandemic prevention in the future, knowing that this is not the last pandemic we'll experience, we have so much trust to rebuild with our respective communities and just the public in general. And I think that comes with a responsibility to become trustworthy messengers and trustworthy presenters of science and data, and putting less responsibility on our communities that we serve that lack the trust for legitimate reasons. But like, I want us to be more trustworthy. And I think that we can do that by having more women that look like us in these roles, mentoring younger women who are interested in these roles. I get a lot of people who ask me, like, how did you get to do the work that you're doing? And actually responding and giving them ways to kind of enter that journey. So I'd love to know for you, what excites you about what could be the future of our roles in these jobs and for Women's History Month next year. Brianna,
I'm excited to see more women of color in leadership roles. I think women and women of color are very much put in these roles of doing labor, and to a certain extent being exploited for our labor and exploited for our ideas, but we're not brought to the table to actually contribute to the vision of what work needs to be done, what policies need to be developed. I truly believe women of color have the solutions. We're just not being heard. So, you know, just imagining leadership where everyone who's represented is a woman of color. Like, why can't we have that? Because we very much have that with white men. So I would love to see more women of color in leadership, not just 2 or 3, but a broad array, a diversity of different types of women of color in leadership. And I really think that's our first step to forming more of these solutions in a more efficient manner.
Yeah, I love that.
You know, Brianna, I can't compete with that. I mean, I have to agree. I think we need more women in leadership, and I think we need more women representing leadership positions. It's not just, you know, the leadership at the top level, but leadership in decision making, and driving some of that. And we need you know, fora where women get mentorship, not just from other women, but also from, you know, men who are part of the movement, because this is about all of us. So I can't think of anything else that is the single most, you know, impactful thing we could do in 1 year. The rest of it is going to take a bit longer.
Well, here's something that next year there's more of us on this chat. There's more of us in position, and that we continue to help foster each other's growth. I'm so thankful for both of you, thankful for this chat, and thankful for all the people who are watching. We will, as I mentioned before, we're going to share this on our grids. You can watch it, share it, and please make sure that you're following both Pandemic Prevention Institute and the Rockefeller Foundation for more updates on our work in responding to COVID-19 and the pandemic and other global issues, as well as amplifying the voices of women of color in STEM. All right, you guys, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
I'll
you.
see you in the
Bye.
chats.
Bye.
Bye.